Have you ever calculated what you actually spend on watering your crops each season? I mean, really calculated it, not just the water bill, but the electricity for the pumps, the maintenance on the system, the hours you spend managing it all. Because here's the thing that really gets me. Your neighbor down the road, with the same 40 acres and the same crops, is somehow spending half what you are. Same soil, same weather, same market prices. So what's going on here? How is he keeping $6,000 in his pocket while you're writing $12,000 checks for the exact same result? I spend way too much time analyzing farm expenses and the psychology behind why farmers make the financial decisions they do. If you've ever wondered how some operations thrive while others barely break even on identical land, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Because understanding this isn't just about satisfying curiosity, it's about not throwing away thousands of dollars every season while your neighbor banks the difference. Let's start with the most obvious question. How much are we actually talking about here? Because when I tell farmers the real numbers on irrigation costs, they usually assume I'm making them up, or talking about some massive industrial operation with 500 acres and a dedicated water management team. The average total irrigation cost for a mid-size farm runs somewhere between $8,000 and $15,000 per growing season. $8,000 to $15,000. That's not just the water bill showing up in your mailbox. That's water plus electricity for running those pumps, plus maintenance on the system, plus the labor hours you're putting into managing it all. And yes, I know what you're thinking. That sounds impossibly high. But let me break it down so you can see exactly where that money goes. Because most farmers have never actually sat down and added up every expense that goes into keeping their crops watered. A typical season for a 40-acre operation looks something like this. You're spending about $4,000 on water itself, depending on your rates and your region. Then there's the electricity to run your pumps. And this is where most farmers I talk to get that shocked look on their faces, because they've never actually calculated their pump electricity costs over a full season. Depending on your system and your power rates, you're looking at another $3,000 to $6,000 just in electricity, just to move the water you're already paying for. Then you've got maintenance and repairs on your irrigation equipment. Broken sprinkler heads, worn-out gaskets, pipes that need replacing, valves that stop working quite right. Conservatively, that runs about $2,000 annually, and that's if you're lucky and nothing major breaks. And finally, there's your time. If you're managing a conventional system, you're spending hours every week checking coverage, adjusting timers, moving equipment, troubleshooting problems. When you actually value your hours properly instead of treating farm labor as free, that adds up to another couple thousand in real economic cost. Add it all up, and you're looking at $12,000 for an average season. $12,000. That's not for some sprawling corporate mega farm with automated everything and a team of engineers monitoring soil moisture in real time. That's the average for a regular 40-acre farm run by someone like you. One person, one operation, standard crops that people have been growing in your region for decades. But here's where it gets worse, and I mean considerably worse. Those numbers I just gave you, they're actually on the conservative side. If you're growing water-intensive crops, like almonds or cotton or corn in a hot climate, your costs can easily push past $15,000 per season. I've talked to farmers spending $18,000 or $20,000, and most of them had no idea their costs were that high until they actually tracked every single expense for a full year, instead of just looking at the obvious water bills. The electricity costs alone are enough to make your eyes water, which is darkly appropriate given what we're talking about. Running irrigation pumps during peak electricity hours, which is when most farmers water because it fits their schedule, can cost you $4,000 to $6,000 per season just in power bills. $4,000 to $6,000 just to run the pumps that move the water you're already paying for. Now, you might be thinking, well, maybe that's just what irrigation costs these days. Maybe there's no way around it. Maybe $12,000 per season is just the price of doing business in modern agriculture. And if that's what you're thinking, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but you're wrong. Dead wrong, actually. Your neighbor down the road with the same 40 acres and the same crops? He's spending about $6,000 per season, half of what you're spending. Same soil type, same weather patterns, same water source, same market prices for his harvest. The only difference is that he's figured out something you haven't, and it's costing you $6,000 every single year. And no, he's not some trust fund farmer with unlimited capital to throw at expensive technology. He's not secretly wealthy or connected to some special water district with subsidized rates or benefiting from some government program you don't know about. He's just not making the same expensive mistakes that have become so normalized in farming that most people think they're unavoidable parts of the business. Let me give you a concrete example of what I'm talking about. I know two farmers who farm adjacent properties, literally right next door to each other, separated by a fence line and nothing else. Both have 40 acres of corn. Both bought their land around the same time. Both use similar tractors and equipment and grow the same varieties from the same seed company. Last season, Tom spent $12,000 on irrigation. Sarah spent $6,200. The difference? Tom waters with conventional overhead sprinklers, on a schedule he inherited from the previous owner 20 years ago. He runs them every 3 days during the growing season, usually starting around noon when he's got time between other chores. Sarah uses drip irrigation with soil moisture sensors that tell her exactly when and how much to water. She waters early morning, before the sun comes up, and only when the actual data shows her crops need it. The difference isn't about income levels or access to information or farming expertise. Both farmers could afford the same equipment if they chose to buy it. Both have internet access and could learn the same techniques if they wanted to. Both grew up farming and know their land intimately. The difference is that Tom is following what seems like common sense, what his father did before him, what he sees other farmers in the area doing. Water regularly, keep everything wet, don't take chances with your crops. Sarah questioned those assumptions and did the math before committing to them. And here's the thing that should really concern you. Tom and Sarah aren't outliers or extreme examples I cherry-picked to make a point. This pattern repeats itself across thousands of farms in every agricultural region. The ones spending $12,000 to $15,000 per season aren't doing anything crazy or unusual or obviously wasteful. They're following conventional wisdom, doing what seems responsible and safe, using methods that have worked for decades. The ones spending $6,000 to $8,000 aren't geniuses with secret knowledge or expensive consultants. They just stopped accepting that high costs were inevitable and started asking whether there might be a better way. The truth is, there's a whole system of conventional practices that keeps farmers bleeding money without ever realizing it. And I say system not because there's some conspiracy or deliberate plan to waste your money, but because these wasteful practices all reinforce each other in ways that make them feel normal and necessary. So how does this waste actually happen? Because most farmers aren't intentionally throwing money away. They're not careless or stupid or reckless with their resources. They're just following practices that seem totally reasonable until you actually look at what's happening to the water and where the money is going. Let's talk about the single most expensive habit in modern farming: watering by gut feeling instead of data. Here's how it typically works. You walk out to your field in the morning, look at the soil, maybe dig your hand in a few inches to feel the moisture level, and make a judgment call based on experience and intuition. Looks a little dry. Feels like it could use water. And because you don't want to risk underwatering and losing yield, which would be catastrophic, you err on the side of caution. You water until everything looks good and properly saturated. Soil's dark, there's moisture visible on top, everything feels right. This approach seems responsible. It's what your father probably did. It's what you see other experienced farmers doing. The problem is, it's costing you somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000 every single season. The reality that most farmers don't want to hear is this: your crops probably need about 60 to 70% of the water you're giving them. Read that again. Your plants need 30 to 40% less water than you're providing. But because you're judging by eye and feel rather than actual soil moisture data measured at root depth, you're overwatering by that same 30 to 40% almost every single time you turn on your system. Your eyes and hands are telling you the surface looks dry, but 6 inches down, where your roots actually live, there's plenty of moisture that you can't see or feel without instruments. Let's run the math on what that actually costs you. A 40-acre farm typically needs about 2 acre-feet of water per growing season for most common crops. At average water rates in most regions, that works out to roughly $4,000. But if you're overwatering by 35%, which is pretty standard for conventional operations that rely on visual inspection, you're actually paying for 2.7 acre-feet instead of 2. That's $5,400 instead of $4,000. That's $1,400 straight into the ground for water your crops never needed and can't even use. But here's the thing. Overwatering is just the beginning of the problem. And honestly, it's not even the most expensive part. Because even if you somehow nailed the perfect amount of water through sheer intuitive genius, there's still the massive issue of when you're applying it. And this is where most farmers lose another $1,000 to $1,500 per season without even realizing the money is disappearing. Most farmers water during the middle of the day. Makes perfect sense from a schedule perspective, right? You're out working on other tasks. You've got time around late morning or early afternoon. The weather's nice, so you flip the switch and let the system run while you move on to the next item on your to-do list. The problem is that watering between 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon, especially during the hot summer months when irrigation matters most, means you're losing 25 to 40% of your water to evaporation before it ever reaches the root zone where your plants can actually use it. Think about what that means in practical terms. You're paying for water. You're paying for the electricity to pump that water out of the ground or through your distribution system. And then, you're watching somewhere between a quarter and a third of it simply evaporate into the atmosphere during the hottest part of the day. You're essentially watering the sky and calling it farming. If you're spending $4,000 on water and losing 35% to midday evaporation, that's another $1,400 just vanishing into thin air. Literally. You might as well be setting $700 bills on fire twice per season and hoping it somehow helps your crops grow. The farmers who figured this out water early morning, typically starting around 5 or 6 a.m. when temperatures are coolest and evaporation rates are at their minimum. Same water, same crops, same pumps, same distribution system. The only difference is 3 or 4 hours on the clock, and that simple timing difference saves them $1,200 to $1,800 per season. So let's add up just these two habits that most farmers think are completely normal and unavoidable. Overwatering by 35% costs you about $1,400 per season. Watering at the wrong time of day costs you another $1,200. That's $2,600 per season from two practices that feel like responsible farming to the people doing them. $2,600 wasted. And we haven't even started talking about your equipment yet. Let's talk about equipment that's slowly bankrupting you while you convince yourself everything is working fine. The average farm irrigation system is somewhere between 10 and 20 years old, which wouldn't necessarily be a problem, except that most farmers have never done a comprehensive efficiency audit on their equipment since the day it was installed. They just assume that if water comes out when they flip the switch, the system is working properly. And technically, sure, it's working. Water is moving. Crops are getting wet. But working and working efficiently are two completely different things, and the gap between them costs you thousands. Old sprinkler systems distribute water unevenly in ways you've probably noticed but never really addressed. You've walked your fields during irrigation and seen it yourself. Some areas are getting drenched, practically flooding, while other spots, 20 feet away, are barely getting damp. That uneven coverage typically results in 15 to 25% waste because you have to run the system long enough to adequately water the dry spots, which means you're massively overwatering everything else in the process. You're paying for water that's pooling uselessly in some areas, while other areas stay perpetually thirsty, and your solution is just to run everything longer. Then there are the leaks, and I'm not talking about the obvious geyser shooting up from a broken main line that you notice immediately and fix the same day. I'm talking about the slow, invisible leaks in underground fittings and connections and valves that you never notice because they're not dramatic enough to grab your attention. These small, steady leaks add up to 10 to 15% of your total water volume just vanishing before it ever reaches your crops. It's dripping away underground where you can't see it, or it's seeping out of slightly loose connections, or it's leaking from valves that don't quite seal properly anymore after 15 years of use. If you've got a drip irrigation system, which is supposedly more efficient, you probably have clogged or broken emitters scattered throughout your field that you've never systematically checked and replaced. The result is that some plants are getting 3 times the water they need, while others, 30 feet away, are getting a third of what they need. You're simultaneously overwatering and underwatering different parts of the same field, which is an impressively inefficient achievement. And because the overall system looks like it's functioning when you glance at it from your truck, you never take the time to walk every line and check every emitter. Let's do the math on equipment inefficiency. If you're losing 25% of your water to uneven coverage, underground leaks, and broken components, and you're spending $12,000 on irrigation annually, that's $3,000 literally leaking into the ground or evaporating from surface puddles or running off into ditches. $3,000 per season, vanishing through equipment that you keep telling yourself still works fine. But here's where it gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean psychologically fascinating, in a way that explains why intelligent people make obviously terrible financial decisions. Most farmers know their equipment is inefficient. They can see the dry spots and the wet spots. They know some of those fittings probably leak. They're aware that their 20-year-old sprinkler heads don't perform like they did when they were new. But they avoid upgrading or doing major repairs because the cost of new equipment feels enormous when you look at it as a single upfront expense. A modern drip irrigation system with proper coverage for 40 acres might cost $5,000 to install. Replacing all your worn-out sprinkler heads and fixing underground leaks might run $3,000. Those numbers feel big and painful and risky when you're looking at them on an invoice or an equipment dealer's quote. But here's what farmers don't calculate, or more accurately, what they actively avoid calculating because the answer is uncomfortable. That $5,000 investment in new equipment saves you $3,000 per season in wasted water and electricity. The system pays for itself in less than 2 growing seasons. After that break-even point, it's pure savings going straight to your bottom line. Over 10 years, that's a $30,000 difference sitting in your bank account versus leaking into the ground. Yet farmers will continue spending $3,000 per year in preventable waste rather than spend $5,000 once to fix the underlying problem. It's like refusing to repair a car that gets 8 miles per gallon because the mechanic wants $2,000. So instead, you just keep spending an extra $3,000 per year on gas forever. The math doesn't make any sense, but the psychology does, because one-time costs feel more painful than ongoing waste. The equipment stays inefficient because the waste is invisible and distributed. No alarm sounds when water leaks from an underground fitting. Your bank account doesn't flash red when a broken sprinkler head overwaters one section of field. The loss happens slowly, quietly, spread across the entire season, so it never feels urgent enough to address. Meanwhile, the cost of new equipment feels concrete and immediate, and painful in a way that grabs your attention. This is what I call the upgrade resistance cycle. And once you're in it, it's remarkably hard to break free. You keep your old equipment because you can't afford to replace it. The old equipment wastes thousands per season. The waste means you have less money available to upgrade. The cycle continues, and every season you fall further behind the farmers who bit the bullet years ago and made the investment. So we've got overwatering, bad timing, and equipment that's bleeding money in ways you've learned to ignore. But here's the question that should really bother you. The question that gets to the heart of why this pattern repeats itself on thousands of farms despite the math being so obviously clear. If the waste is this apparent, if the solutions are this straightforward, why do so many intelligent, experienced farmers keep doing exactly the same expensive things year after year? The answer isn't about stupidity or ignorance or lack of care. It's about psychology, and specifically about invisible forces that make wasteful practices feel like the responsible, safe, traditional choice that good farmers are supposed to make. Here's where the story gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean psychologically fascinating, in ways that explain why smart people consistently make financially catastrophic decisions. Let's start with what I call the tradition trap, which might be the single most expensive sentence in all of agriculture. This is how we've always done it. Multi-generational farms inherit watering schedules the same way they inherit land deeds and equipment and the family name on the mailbox. Dad watered every 3 days during the growing season, so you water every 3 days. Grandpa ran the sprinklers for 4 hours at a time, so that's what you do too. Nobody questions it because it worked for them, right? The farm survived, the crops grew, the operation continued for another generation. What they don't realize, what they actively refuse to calculate, is that their father was farming in an era when water costs were literally 1/4 of what they are today, and electricity was one-third the price. The watering schedule that made perfect financial sense in 1975 is economic suicide in 2024, but it feels like wisdom. It feels like respecting tradition and proven methods and the accumulated knowledge of people who successfully farmed this exact land for decades. Questioning it feels like arrogance, like thinking you're smarter than 3 generations of farmers who knew this land better than you ever will. So you keep following Dad's schedule, and every season you're paying $3,000 as a tax on nostalgia for a time when water was cheap and waste didn't matter. Then there's the fear of underwatering from drought stress. They're paying $2,000 extra per season to avoid a $600 theoretical risk that probably wouldn't happen anyway. But the math doesn't matter when you're lying awake at 3 in the morning imagining your corn withering in a hot week while everyone drives past your farm and sees your failure from the road. There's also an identity component here that most farmers don't want to admit exists, but it's powerful and it's expensive. Real farmers water by experience and intuition developed over years of working the land, not fancy technology that treats farming like a computer science problem. Using soil moisture sensors feels like admitting you don't really know your own land. Weather-based irrigation scheduling seems like something a city person who read about farming on the internet would do, not someone who actually lives and breathes agriculture. The resistance isn't really about cost or technical complexity. It's about self-image and what it means to be an authentic farmer, rather than someone who needs computers to tell them what any experienced person should already know. I know a farmer who'll spend 20 minutes explaining how he can tell soil moisture by the color of the dirt and the way it crumbles in his hand when he picks it up. He's genuinely proud of this skill, and honestly, he's probably pretty accurate with his assessments. And he's also spending $4,000 more per season than his neighbor, who uses $40 moisture sensors and bases watering decisions on actual data. His expertise is real. His intuition is probably better than most. But it's costing him $40,000 over 10 years because he can't separate his identity as a skilled farmer from the simple question of whether there might be a more efficient method. Finally, there's the sunk cost trap, which catches even farmers who understand all the other psychological issues. You've been using the same irrigation system for 15 years. You know it's inefficient. You know it wastes water. But changing now feels like admitting those 15 years were a mistake. And nobody wants to feel that way about decisions they've already made and can't take back. I've used these sprinklers since 2009. Why would I change now? Because those 15 years represent $30,000 to $45,000 in accumulated waste that's already gone. And keeping the system means losing another $3,000 every single season going forward. But that money is already spent. It's not coming back whether you upgrade tomorrow or never. The only question is whether you're going to keep bleeding money or finally stop the leak. But that's not how it feels emotionally. Emotionally, it feels like admitting you've been wrong for 15 years. These psychological traps aren't signs of weakness or character flaws or lack of intelligence. They're completely normal human responses to uncertainty and change, and the difficulty of admitting that traditional methods might not be optimal. But normal doesn't mean free. Every season, these invisible forces convince thousands of farmers to make expensive choices that feel responsible and safe while their bank accounts slowly drain, and their neighbors who question those same traditions build wealth instead. But perhaps the most concerning part isn't just understanding the psychology or recognizing the mechanisms. It's watching what all these factors add up to when you combine them in real life. Because farmers aren't just making one of these mistakes in isolation. They're usually making 3 or 4 of them simultaneously, and the compound effect is genuinely disturbing when you see it play out day after day, season after season. Let me paint you a picture of what this actually looks like in practice, because abstract numbers don't capture the daily reality of how these expensive decisions unfold. Meet John. He's not a real person, but he represents about 40% of the farmers I've talked to about irrigation costs over the years. John has a 40-acre corn operation. He's been farming for 12 years. He's not lazy, he's not stupid, he's not reckless. He's just following what seems like normal, responsible farming practice based on everything he learned and observed growing up around agriculture. Monday morning, John walks through his field. The soil looks a little dry to him when he examines it, Feels like it could use water when he digs his hand in a few inches. It's 10:30 in the morning. He's got time between other chores that need doing, so he turns on his sprinkler system. He runs it for 4 hours, which is what his father always did, and what seems about right based on how long it takes for everything to look properly wet. The coverage isn't perfect because some of his sprinkler heads are 15 years old and don't distribute quite evenly anymore, but it's good enough. Water is getting to the crops. Everything looks thoroughly soaked by the time he shuts it off at 2:30 in the afternoon. Wednesday, same routine. He checks the field, soil looks dry on top, turns on the system midday when it's convenient. Doesn't really think about the fact that it's 95 degrees out and half the water is probably evaporating before it soaks down to root depth where it actually matters. Friday afternoon, his neighbor Sarah mentions something about soil moisture sensors while they're both at the feed store. "You should check those out. Saved me a bunch of money on water this year." John nods politely, but he's thinking to himself, "I've been farming this land for 12 years. I know when it needs water. I don't need some gadget to tell me what I can see and feel with my own hands." The conversation ends. The idea dies. Nothing changes. Saturday, John sits down to pay bills. Water and electricity for the week come to $1,100. Seems high, but that's just what irrigation costs during summer, right? It's hot, crops need water, you can't skimp on something this important. He doesn't run the calculation that he actually needed, about $700 worth of water, and just wasted $400 through overwatering, bad timing, and equipment inefficiency. The waste is invisible to him, so he sees the full $1,100 as necessary farming expense. That's 1 week in John's life. Nothing dramatic, nothing obviously wrong. Over a 20-week growing season, John's going to waste about $8,000. But he'll never see it as waste or mistake. To him, it's just the cost of farming. He's doing what seems responsible, what his father taught him, what he sees other farmers in the area doing. Water regularly, keep everything wet, don't take chances. John's not eating ramen noodles to afford his irrigation bill. He's not desperately poor or struggling to survive. He's doing okay, but his farm netted $18,000 in profit last year. If he'd cut his irrigation waste by actually measuring instead of guessing, that number would have been $26,000. That $8,000 difference isn't just a number on a spreadsheet. It's a new tractor payment, or his kids' braces, or an emergency fund for when major equipment breaks. It's the difference between a farm that's building wealth and generational security versus a farm that's just treading water year after year. Meanwhile, 3 miles away, there's Sarah with her 40-acre corn operation. Same weather, same soil type, same market prices, same basic challenges. Last season, Sarah spent $4,800 total on irrigation. 4 years ago, Sarah bought soil moisture sensors for $800. 3 years ago, she upgraded to drip irrigation, cost her $4,500. Total investment, $5,300. Those first few months, after spending that money, she second-guessed herself constantly. That much money felt huge, felt risky, felt like maybe she was overthinking something her father and grandfather had managed just fine without computers and sensors telling them what to do. But here's what actually happened. That first season after the upgrade, her irrigation costs dropped from $12,000 to $6,200. She saved $5,800 in a single season. The equipment paid for itself before harvest even came. Second season, another $5,500 in savings. Third season, $5,700 saved. Fourth season, where we are now, $5,200 in savings compared to what she used to spend. Total investment, $5,300. Total savings over 4 years, $28,000. She didn't just save money in some abstract sense, she built wealth. That money went into a savings account that actually has a balance now. Some of it went toward a down payment on adjacent land that came up for sale. Some went into better equipment for other parts of her operation that needed attention. The math is absolutely obvious when you lay it out like this, but John's never laid it out. He's never sat down and calculated his actual total irrigation cost per season. He's never compared himself to efficient operations like Sarah's. He's never questioned whether his methods are optimal or just conventional. He just knows that farming costs money and water costs money, and that's life. And he's doing what seems normal based on what everyone around him appears to be doing. And here's the thing that should genuinely bother you. This isn't a story about smart farmers versus dumb farmers or hardworking farmers versus lazy farmers. John and Sarah probably have the same IQ. They went to similar agricultural extension courses. They have access to the same information on the internet. They both care deeply about their land and their operations. The difference is that Sarah questioned conventional wisdom 4 years ago, and John trusted it. Sarah did the math before committing to methods, and John assumed the traditional numbers would work themselves out. That single difference in approach cost John $28,000 over 4 years, and the meter is still running. So let's talk about what this really costs over the long term. Because that's where this story goes, from concerning to genuinely disturbing. A season or two of waste might not feel catastrophic in the moment. You're still farming, crops are still growing, the operation continues. But when you actually sit down and run the real numbers over 5 or 10 years, the picture that emerges should make any rational person deeply uncomfortable. Here's where the math gets really interesting. And by interesting, I mean absolutely sobering from a financial planning perspective that most farmers actively avoid thinking about. Let's take what we've been calling a typical scenario and run the actual numbers that most farmers never bother to calculate because they don't really want to know the answer. We'll use John as our baseline for conventional wasteful practices and Sarah as the efficient comparison. John spends $12,000 per season on irrigation through his combination of overwatering, midday watering timing, and inefficient equipment. Sarah, with her data-driven efficient system, spends $6,000 per season. Over 10 growing seasons, a reasonable time frame for evaluating farming decisions, John will spend $120,000 on irrigation. Sarah will spend $60,000. The raw difference between them is $60,000. $60,000 over 10 years. Let me put that in perspective, so it doesn't just sound like an abstract number. That's not a rounding error or, well, farming costs money, and there's nothing you can do about it. That's a brand new tractor sitting in your barn. That's half a down payment on a decent house. That's your kid's entire college education at a state school with some money left over. That's the measurable difference between a farm that's building generational wealth and a farm that's barely staying financially solvent despite working just as hard. But here's where it gets worse, considerably worse actually, because we haven't even started talking about opportunity cost yet. That $6,000 per season that Sarah saves compared to John? She's not stuffing it under her mattress or letting it sit in a checking account earning nothing. She's investing it. Even with conservative market returns, let's say 8% annually, which is reasonable for a diversified index fund over a decade, that money compounds and grows. After 10 years of consistently investing that $6,000 annual savings, Sarah has approximately $87,000 in her investment account. John has $0 in his investment account from those savings because he never had those savings to invest in the first place. Actually, John has less than zero when you factor in that his 15-year-old inefficient irrigation equipment is worth maybe $8,000 at this point, while Sarah's 7-year-old efficient equipment is still worth about the same value. So the actual wealth gap between these two identical farms isn't just $60,000 in spent money that one farmer wasted and the other didn't. It's $87,000 in accumulated, compounded wealth sitting in Sarah's accounts versus essentially nothing for John. That's an $87,000 swing in net worth, from one decision made years ago to either question conventional irrigation wisdom or blindly trust it. Let me phrase that differently so the full impact lands. John didn't just waste $60,000 on unnecessary irrigation costs. He lost the opportunity to turn that $60,000 into $87,000 through basic conservative investing. The real economic cost of his conventional irrigation practices is approximately $147,000 in wealth difference between his operation and Sarah's operation. $147,000 in net worth difference from watering decisions alone. And we still haven't factored in all the secondary costs that nobody thinks about when they're standing in an equipment dealer's showroom debating whether to upgrade their irrigation system. Sarah's automated drip system with moisture sensors saves her somewhere between 5 and 8 hours per week in labor, compared to John's manual management of conventional sprinklers. She's not walking fields, checking coverage patterns. She's not spending time moving equipment or adjusting timers. She's not troubleshooting why Section B isn't getting enough water while Section D is flooding. Over a typical 20-week growing season, that's 100 to 160 hours of her life given back. Over 10 years, that's 1,000 to 1,600 hours saved. That's somewhere between half a work year and a full work year of time that Sarah got back to spend on other parts of her operation that actually build value, or with her family, or on maintenance that genuinely matters for long-term farm health. John spent those same 1,000 to 1,600 hours over 10 years managing his inefficient system, walking fields, adjusting things manually, worrying, troubleshooting. It's like spending 40 hours per week pedaling a stationary bike. Technically, you're working hard and putting in effort, but you're not actually going anywhere or building anything. There's also the stress and mental load factor that's completely impossible to quantify on a spreadsheet, but absolutely real for anyone who's actually farmed. John worries about his irrigation decisions constantly. Did he water enough this week? Too much? Is that slightly dry patch in the north section going to cost him yield? Should he run the system one more time just to be safe, even though it'll push his costs higher? Every decision is essentially a guess, based on imperfect visual information. And every guess carries the psychological weight of potential crop loss that could cascade into financial disaster. Sarah checks her soil moisture data on her phone in about 30 seconds. The numbers tell her exactly when to water and for how long, based on actual root zone moisture levels and weather forecasts. There's no guessing, no anxiety, no 3 a.m. thoughts about whether she should have watered differently yesterday. The mental burden alone is worth thousands in avoided stress and better sleep, even though it never shows up on a balance sheet or tax return. But let's get back to the hard numbers one more time, because those are what ultimately matter when you're trying to understand the real cost of following conventional irrigation practices without questioning them. Over 10 years, the efficient farmer has built nearly $90,000 in investable wealth while maintaining equipment that's just as functional as the wasteful farmer's equipment. The wasteful farmer has spent an extra $60,000 compared to the efficient farmer and has absolutely nothing to show for it except memories of watching water evaporate into summer sky and hoping it was enough. That's not farming. That's wealth destruction with sprinklers attached. So there you have it. The mystery of how farmers keep wasting thousands of dollars on irrigation every single season isn't really a mystery at all when you break it down piece by piece. It's a carefully orchestrated combination of invisible losses, powerful psychological traps, and mathematical realities that most people never force themselves to sit down and actually calculate because the answers are too uncomfortable to face. Here's the psychological trap that makes this whole cycle so remarkably hard to break, even after you understand all the numbers and see all the evidence laid out in front of you. Farmers develop what I can only describe as irrigation Stockholm syndrome. They become emotionally attached to their wasteful practices because those practices feel like farming itself, like the essence of what it means to work the land the right way. The land isn't just a business asset or a means of generating income. It's identity. It's family legacy, stretching back generations. It's your connection to parents and grandparents and great-grandparents who successfully worked this same soil and kept the operation alive through depressions and droughts and every kind of hardship. When someone suggests you should fundamentally change how you water your crops, it doesn't feel like a helpful suggestion to improve efficiency and save money. It feels like an attack on everything you know about farming, everything your family taught you, everything that makes you a real farmer instead of just someone who owns agricultural land. I've farmed this land for 20 years. I know when it needs water. I can tell by looking at it and feeling the soil. And you probably do know when it needs water, at least roughly. Your experience and intuition are real and valuable. But knowing when your crops need water and knowing exactly how much water they need are two entirely different skills that require different tools, and confusing those two skills costs you somewhere between $2,000 and $4,000 per season. Every season, year after year, the agricultural equipment industry and water districts and electricity providers understand this psychology better than most farmers understand themselves. They've spent decades normalizing these inefficient practices, not through some evil conspiracy or deliberate plan to waste your money, but just through the natural evolution of an industry that fundamentally profits when farmers use more water and more equipment and more electricity rather than less. Equipment dealers don't talk about 10-year opportunity costs, or wealth-building strategies, or investment returns when they're selling you irrigation equipment. They focus on what seems normal based on what everyone else is doing, what your neighbors use, what your dad did, and what his dad did before him. They emphasize tradition and proven methods, and not taking risks with something as important as crop irrigation. The sales process has been refined over multiple generations to overcome every rational objection you might raise. Worried about the upfront investment cost? Well, everyone waters this way. It's just what farming costs in modern agriculture. You can't expect to run a farm on the cheap. Concerned about learning new technology or trusting computers with something as critical as irrigation? Your father and grandfather did just fine without sensors and data and automation. Trust your instincts and your experience. That's what real farmers do. Nervous about the risk of changing systems and potentially making a mistake that costs you yield? Better safe than sorry. You can't be too careful when your crops and your income are on the line. Every standard response in the playbook is specifically designed to keep you doing exactly what you're already doing, which means keep you spending what you're already spending, which means keeping you trapped in a cycle of waste that feels like responsible, traditional, real farming, while your bank account slowly drains and efficient farmers 3 miles away build wealth instead. The next time you see your neighbor's irrigation bill half the size of yours for the same acreage and the same crops, remember that they're probably not secretly wealthy or farming easier land or getting special deals from the water district that you don't have access to. They just did the math that you've been avoiding. They questioned whether $12,000 per season was actually necessary or just conventionally normal. They decided that feeling like a traditional real farmer wasn't worth $6,000 per year in preventable waste. And maybe, just maybe, that soil moisture sensor sitting in your online shopping cart for the past 3 months isn't looking so complicated or unnecessary after